Good evening, I hope everyone's well today. Thank you for watching, it is appreciated as always. If you find value in this video, consider liking and subscribing, it does help the channel out a lot. There's been a lot of talk from NATO chiefs, our own Chief of Defence Staff and MI6 recently about preparing for war with Russia. Mark Rutte warns Europe is Putin's next target and faces a scale of conflict our grandparents had endured. Do we believe this? I'm going to look into this in a bit more detail. I don't personally, and we'll get into why in a moment or two. Now, this is our current Chief of Defence Staff, and he mirrors what the NATO chief said.
Impact on all of us will be the cost of building this resilience.
This is the Chief of the Defence Staff, and his name is Sir Rich Kingston. That's important, I'll get into that in a moment. He is the professional head of the British Armed Forces, subordinate only to His Majesty the King as Commander-in-Chief. But we'll get into that in a moment or two.
And daughters, colleagues, veterans will all have a part to play. To build, to serve, and if necessary, to fight. And more families will know what sacrifice for our nation means.
This is a political move, nothing else. This is petty politics. A lot of people are saying, well, I'm not going to fight for England, I'm not going to fight for the UK, why should I? Why should I bother? That's a valid argument, and again, I'll address that later in the video. Rhetoric is nice, but you need to look at the actions behind the rhetoric as well. As the old adage is, actions speak louder than words. First of all, this guy, Rich Kingston, who's the professional head of the armed forces, let's have a look. He became Chief of Defence Staff earlier this year, September 25. He's had a long RAF career, joined in 1988, specialising as an engineering officer rather than as a pilot or a frontline commander. According to his biography, his only operational tour in conflict was a senior engineering officer support in the Kosovo War in the late 90s. This was in a support role rather than a commanding combat forces in action. In short, he doesn't command troops. He's never commanded troops, and this is the professional head of the British Armed Forces. In a specific sense, he is one of the more senior UK military chiefs in recent memory without a record of commanding troops directly in combat operations. However, he has seen operational service in a support role during the Kosovo War, so technically counts as involvement in a military campaign, even though he was not in a frontline combat command. Does that sound like a country that's going to war anytime soon? We've got the head of the armed forces, and they've not actually seen any actual frontline service, and they've never commanded troops in the field. If Britain was going to war, or gesturing or threatening to go to war with Russia, wouldn't we have someone who was actually capable of leading the military in combat as the head of the army and the head of the armed forces? I would vote for yes. I would say yes, we would be doing that. We've not done that. And then you look at the military spending, and you look at the military spending that we're currently spending, alright, the current defence spending. As of the last available data in late 2025, the UK defence spending for the financial year 24-25, approximately 60 billion, pittance, equivalent to about 2.3 to 2.4% of GDP, according to NATO estimates and government figures. This includes core ministry MOD expenditure, with real terms increases in recent years driven by inflation adjustments and commitments. For the current financial year 25-26, the plans from the spending review have set defence spending at around 62.2 billion. That's the core MOD budget, rising further in subsequent years. NATO projections for 25 indicate that the UK is expected to spend about 2.4% of GDP on defence. Rhetoric is nice. Rhetoric doesn't win wars. Actions, not words, will define if we're going to war. If we were going to war, you would think that would be looting a war chest, actually putting a war chest into effect. You'd expect defence spending to increase substantially. We're not doing this. Actions, not words, are important. Rhetoric alone is pointless, and I'll get into why the rhetoric matters in a minute or two. Commitments in the budget. In the autumn budget delivered by Rachel from Accounts on November 25, reconfirmed existing commitments without introducing major new funding announcements, specifically in defence, in the document. The key points include that the government is committed to an increase in defence spending to 2.5 of GDP by April 27, or 2.6 including additional security and intelligence elements such as single intelligence accounts. There is an ambition to reach 3% of GDP in the next Parliament. They won't be running it, so it will be up to them anyway. Longer term, UK is aligned with a new NATO target to reach 3.5% of GDP on core defence by 2035, with additional spending on a broader national security / resilience to bring the total national security spending to 5% of GDP by then. Earlier in 2025, February this year, additional funding was allocated 2.2 billion for the 2025-26 year to support the path to the 2.5% increase. The budget emphasised that using defence spending to drive economic growth, jobs and investment in the UK industries, shipbuilding, munitions, innovation in Portsmouth, Barrow and Plymouth. We're not going to war. We're really not. This is a two-pronged approach by the government, actually three-pronged. The first prong is to scare the bejesus out of the regular man and woman on the street. They want you in fear, they want you afraid, they want total control. What's the best way to do that? To say, well, we've got these external threats and we are at risk of being invaded, not by the dinghy divers from France, but by an actual hostile acting state, such as the boogeyman, which is Russia. Okay, so they want you afraid. The second is they're probably leaning into what Boris done in the last Parliament, which is he was very strong on Ukraine, he was very strong on foreign policy and our rhetoric against Russia. And Keir Starmer, who has completely flopped domestically, everybody in the country hates him, the pubs are banning all Labour MPs, as they should, nobody wants him in office, the unions have rejected him, so what has he pivoted to? Foreign policy. That's why he's always abroad. That's why he's never in the country. That's why he prefers Davos to Westminster. All of these things he thinks is going to save his arse. It's not. It's delaying the inevitable. And finally, it's to scare NATO members into actually paying their fair fucking share of military spend. They don't. The first priority of any country is defence of the realm, defence of the country. Not pissing all your money up the wall on benefits for scroungers. That's what many of the socialist countries on the continent of Europe have done. They're shirking their commitments to NATO, they're expecting America to pick up the tab, and America is sick of it. So we're not going to war, we're not financing for war, the government's not financing for war. Cool your heels. Now, on the broader point, would I fight for Britain currently, as it currently stands? Well, no. If you look at the boomer generation, they had something to come back to. They had a country they could recognise. They could actually go out and they could scrape a living by. They could raise families. They could buy a house. They could afford to live in this United Kingdom. Many people, especially in the lower classes, I would say anybody who's not upper middle class or upper class, has a very hard time living in this country. And it shouldn't be that way. It's because the state has got too big and it's too busy looking after itself, rather than remembering it's there to serve the people, not itself. If you like this video and you think I'm onto something, make me aware. The final thought I will leave you with is the declaration Russia gave NATO when it invaded Ukraine. It says, "We are a nuclear power. We will use our nuclear weapons if you interfere with this war." That is the warning that a nuclear power gave NATO. And why did they do that? Because that's exactly what your nuclear deterrent is there for. They have warned us they would use their nukes on us, and we would use them back as retaliation, as mutually assured destruction. So if we intervened in a war with Russia, a hot war with Russia, rather than actually using Ukraine as a proxy, it's not worth the risk. Again, I'll leave you with that thought, a nice sobering thought. Like and subscribe, do all that good stuff. Have a good day.